There we go. All right. So welcome everybody. Thanks for coming out for Science Fiction After Vonnegut here at Sturgis Library, both in person, you can't see the people around me, and digitally, they're on Zoom. We really appreciate you coming to spend some time with us, and we appreciate your enthusiasm for the genre. Before we get going, we're gonna read the author's bios. Throughout the program, we're gonna be posting links to different independent bookstores where you can purchase the author's books or pre-order them, because some of our authors have stuff coming out later in the year, which is gonna be awesome. So just keep that on your radar. And so everyone is muted, just to let you know. If you need anything, go through the chat. I'll be more than happy to answer questions. We're going to do a Q&A at the very end, and the way that's going to work is you'll put your questions in and I will moderate them. So just if questions come to you as this is going on, just put them in there, jot them down, whatever, or save them for the end, whatever makes you happy, because we're cool with that. So let's get going. We're going to start off with some bios. So the first is for Charlie Jane Anders. Charlie Jane Anders is the author of Victories Greater Than Death, the first book in a new young adult trilogy, which came out in April of 2021. Up next, Never Say You Can't Survive, a book about how to use creative writing to get through hard times, and a short story collection called Even Greater Mistakes. Her other books include The City in the Middle of the Night and All the Birds in the Sky. Her fiction and journalism have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Slate, McSweeney's, Mother Jones, the Boston Review, Tor.com, Tin House, Teen Vogue, Conjunctions, Wired Magazine, and other places. Her TED Talk, Go Ahead, Dream About the Future, got 700,000 views in its first week. With Annalee Newitz, she co-hosts the podcast Our Opinions Are Correct. Next, we've got Matt Bell. Matt Bell's next novel, Appleseed, which just came out, so it should say Matt Bell's novel, Appleseed, was published by Customs House in July. His craft book, Refused to Be Done, A Guide to Novel Writing, Rewriting, and Revision, will follow in early 2022 from Soho Press. He is also the author of the novels Scrapper and In the House Upon the Dirt Between the Lake and the Woods, as well as the short story collection A Tree or a Person or a Wall, a nonfiction book about the classic video game Baldur's Gate 2, which is great, and several other titles. His writing has appeared in the New York Times, Tin House, Conjunctions, Fairy Tale Review, American Short Fiction, and many other publications. A native to Michigan, he teaches creative writing at Arizona State University. Next on the list is Lincoln Michel. Did I get it?
Yes.
Yes, I'm the worst. Lincoln Michel is the author of the collection Upright Beasts and the forthcoming novel, The Body Scout. His fiction appears or is forthcoming in the Paris Review, Noon, FNSF, Granta, Lightspeed, the Pushcart Prize Anthology, and elsewhere. You can find him online at lincolnmichel.com or on Twitter at @TheLincoln. Then we got Sequoia Nagamatsu. Sequoia Nagamatsu is the author of the forthcoming novels How High We Go in the Dark and Girl Zero, and the story collection Where We Go When All We Were Is Gone, which was a silver medal winner of the 2016 Forward Review's Indie Book of the Year Award, an Entropy Magazine Best Book of 2016, and a notable book at BuzzFeed. His work has appeared in or is forthcoming from publications such as Conjunctions, the Southern Review, Ziziva, Tin House, Iowa Review, Lightspeed Magazine, and One World, a global anthology of short stories, and has been listed as notable in Best American Non-Required Reading and the Best Horror of the Year. He teaches creative writing at St. Olaf College and the Rainer Writing Workshop Low Residency MFA program, and lives in Minneapolis with his wife and writer, Cole Nagamatsu, their cat, Kalahira, their real dog, Fenris, and a robot dog named Calvino. And then finally, we've got Sarah Pinsker. Sarah Pinsker is the author of over 50 works of short fiction, 2 novels, and 1 collection. Her work has won 3 Nebula Awards, the Philip K. Dick Award, and the Theodore Sturgeon Award, and has been nominated for numerous Nebula, Hugo, Locus, and World Fantasy Awards. Her fiction has been published in magazines including Asimov's Strange Horizons, Fantasy and Science Fiction, and Uncanny, and in numerous anthologies and year's best. Sarah's first collection, the Philip K. Dick award-winning Sooner or Later, Everything Falls into the Sea Stories, was published by Small Beer Press in March of 2019. And her first novel, A Song for a New Day, was published by Penguin Random House Berkeley in September of 2019. Her latest book is We Are Satellites, published in May of 2021. She's also a singer-songwriter with 3 albums on various independent labels, the 3rd with her rock band, Stalking Horses, and a 4th in the works. She lives in Baltimore, Maryland, and can be found online at sarahpinsker.com. And you can find all of her books on that table over there. At least people physically here can find them, not you at home. But that is everyone's bio. And now for what everyone actually came for, right? We're gonna start off with some questions. I've done everything in alphabetical order, so I'm just gonna do this in the same way. So we're gonna start off with question number 1. What's the fun elevator pitch for your most recent book? And if you hate the idea of an elevator pitch, feel free to like ramble and say whatever you want. Charlie, Jane, if you wouldn't mind starting us off, that would be awesome.
Sure. Okay, so Never Say You Can't Survive, which is out today, is a guide to how to get through the garbage times by making up your own stories. And it's basically about like accessing the storyteller who's inside you already. We all have a storyteller inside us, and just creating your own fictional worlds and your own imaginary people, and just using that as like kind of an alternate reality that you can get lost in when the world is on fire and there's a pandemic and everything is horrible. And so I was hoping this book would be less timely in 2021 than in 2020, and I think that unfortunately it is still very timely. So that's good for me but bad for the world. But anyway, it's out today, and it's just full of tips and ideas and like just meditations on writing.
And then whoever wants to go next goes next. I don't pick every single thing. That would be I feel weird.
I can go next. We can keep going in alphabetical order for a minute, right? Maybe we'll break that pattern later. But start. My novel Appleseed came out last month. It's an epic environmental novel spanning 1,000 years of past, present, and future. It begins with a mythological retelling of Johnny Appleseed in 1799, and then it ends in a far future glacial America. Trying to think if I had a fun pitch. I have jokingly described it as a season of Westworld, as if it was written by Wendell Berry and Annie Dillard, plus fawns and witches. I think that's pretty close to what it is. Thanks, Corey. Should I pass it to someone? Would that be easiest? Like if I called on Sequoia now, that would be helpful.
Go to town.
All right. So I'm going to talk about how high we go in the dark. So I'm just going to give you kind of like my standard, I guess, elevator pitch here. So I'll hold it up so you can get a good look at it. How it's not a children's book, as you can see. How High We Go in the Dark is a multi-generational journey about holding on to memory and embracing the possibilities for life in the aftermath of tragedy. The novel kicks off in Siberia in 2030, where scientists have unearthed the 30,000-year-old remains of a girl who may not be completely human, along with an unusual virus. FYI, wrote this over 10 years, so definitely pre-COVID. The following years follow a cast of intricately linked characters who navigate what comes to be known as the Arctic Plague, an employee at a theme park designed to provide euthanasia services via roller coaster, a painter on an interstellar starship, a deceased mother's robotic dog, a telepathic organ donor pig, and present in many of these journeys are hints at another character whose journey began billions of years ago. But who this character is and how they fit into the novel is part of the mystery that you'll need to discover. So I will pass it off to Lincoln.
Thanks. Yeah, my novel is The Body Scout. This is The Galley. It comes out in almost exactly a month from Orbit. It's basically a near future cyberpunk noir type book, except the cyber has been replaced with flesh, by which I mean it's a world where body modification, gene editing, and advanced pharmaceuticals are the major realm of technological development and corporate control, I guess. It also features philosophical Neanderthals, eco-terrorist cults, and cyborg baseball players, with a lot of other fun things too, or hopefully fun things. And then I'll pass it to Sarah.
I automatically reached for the unmute, but we're not muted. So this is We Are Satellites. It is it's about a near future technology, which is a brain implant, and one that gradually becomes ubiquitous in society, and it follows follows one family and how that implant affects the various members of the family. So it's, I guess it's about technology and what we allow and what we choose to take upon ourselves. And I don't usually talk about what my book is about, so I think I'm gonna go horribly awry with this. So maybe I won't talk about what it's about. It's about a brain implant and a bunch of people and who gets it and who doesn't and why.
And all of them sound amazing. If you're looking for any of these books, you will be able to find them at Sturgis Library if you live nearby. I know there's a bunch of people watching this in like California, and I don't expect you to come out here to get a library book. So no worries there. Our second question is that, I mean, there should be a little introduction to this also, is some of you might be wondering, like, why are we talking about Kurt Vonnegut specifically? And the answer is Kurt Vonnegut used to be one of the trustees for our library back in the 70s. And his family also lived right down the road. So Vonnegut's very like near and dear to our heart. If you're in the area, we have a sweet Vonnegut collection. If you ever want to see a cigarette that Kurt Vonnegut once smoked, I will show you that cigarette. But yeah, so every year in August, we usually do a celebration of Kurt Vonnegut. We do like, what do they call it? Marathon readings of his novels. We have discussions and stuff. And this year we're doing this. So the first question about Vonnegut is going to start with Matt. So Matt and everyone else, can you share with us any story of how Vonnegut's writing influenced your own work, or what you think of as his influence on the genre in general?
Yeah, thanks, Corey. I'm actually really sad that cigarette isn't like our 6th panel member. I feel like if we could have that in a Zoom on its own, that'd be great. You know, I think Vonnegut was one of the first like contemporary writers I kind of started reading when I was starting to write, when I was maybe 20 or so. I remember buying Timequake in a Barnes and Noble like 20 years ago and just being kind of knocked out by it. And then just reading like all of Vonnegut in the summer, like I just like hadn't read something like that. And so it was like a really strong sort of first contact. You know, I don't think it was somebody I ever really tried to imitate that have that kind of direct influence, but I remember being really excited about all the rules he seemed to be breaking, what I thought were the rules of writing at that time, right? The sort of just like general irreverence, the ability to move quickly through time, like with or without a sci-fi conceit. I reread Slaughterhouse-Five and Bluebeard this week, and they move through time almost exactly the same way, because one of them has aliens and time travel, right? I mean, I think that was always really interesting. The way he spoke kind of directly to history and to culture seemed sort of new to me. You know, rereading his books this week, all that still feels pretty invigorating. It still feels exciting to sort of contact now. Yeah, I don't know, somebody's been with me for a long time. It's one of my favorite writers as long as I've been writing. And I'm glad that influence is still there. May I pass it to Sarah this time?
I tried to unmute myself again. Yeah, so I was trying to think of what my introduction to Vonnegut was, because I think it actually ties into how he affects my writing. My 7th grade teacher did a unit that was, so she didn't say that this was what it was, but it was science fiction and fantasy shorts. And it was The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas, Of Mist and Grass and Sand by Vonda McIntyre, The Ship Who Sang by Anne McCaffrey, Harrison Bergeron by Vonnegut. Those are like, I remember the course from 7th grade, and then 9th grade in public school in Canada. I don't know if this is an American public school thing. We read Cat's Cradle, and what I took away from both of those things, I was already like writing short fiction and submitting it in 7th grade. I'm really glad none of those stories actually got accepted, but I think what I took away, because I was already reading my father's collection of science fiction, and both of my parents had a great collection of short fiction in general. And I just took away this total blurring of lines. I took away the fact that if teachers were teaching it, then, you know, it was something you were allowed to write. It was something that like, you know, then we also read Shakespeare and we read Margaret Atwood, and we read, so like these things are on a par with each other. And so that was really important to me, to know that there were these writers who can just sort of do what they want. Like Vonnegut, I don't think I realized at the time, but you know, he could write for a women's magazine, and he could write for Playboy, and he could write for FNSF. So just like being able to, and I think the Atlantic, like various Colliers, like just jumping from, you know, going where the story needed you to go and not caring about having a niche. Oh, and I'll call on Charlie Jane.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I got into Vonnegut, I think when I was in my late teens. My older brother was really into Vonnegut, and I sort of just got sucked into reading his stuff. And I've read a ton of Vonnegut in my late teens, early 20s, and I've read more over the years. I feel like I just love like the snarkiness of his writing and the kind of defamiliarization, all the ways that he kind of, I feel like, I was thinking about this earlier today, I feel like he was part of this generation of kind of cis white dudes, kind of like Philip Roth and Updike and some of those guys who were kind of, poking at the dissatisfactions of like imperial America, like post World War II imperial America, this kind of like American dream that we were all like, that everybody, well, not we, because I wasn't there, but that people were trapped inside in the post World War II generation, and the kind of hypocrisy and all the weirdness of it. And I feel like he was much more effective than most of his contemporaries at kind of like exposing the ridiculousness and weirdness of America. And I feel like he had a huge influence on my writing for sure. Like I always kind of try to kind of like, I keep trying to come back to that sense of like, bitter whimsy is the best way I can put it. Like it's whimsy, but it's not happy or sweet. It's actually very dark and bitter and kind of angry. And I feel like that certainly pops up a lot in All the Birds in the Sky. Like I feel like All the Birds in the Sky, I very much consciously thought of it as like trying to, in conversation with Vonnegut. And I feel like, in order to write like Vonnegut in 2021, you wouldn't write like Vonnegut. You would write, like I think that what was revolutionary in like the 60s and 70s is now not. But I think that something of that kind of approach to kind of pulling back and showing the ridiculousness and the weirdness of the everyday, like that defamiliarization I was talking about, is still super, super potent. Oh, and I'll call on, wait, who hasn't talked yet? I'm sorry. I've had a very long day. Sequoia, yeah.
Yeah, I love everybody's answers thus far. I think like Charlie Jane, I came to Vonnegut probably in middle school, partly as a result of me having to take remedial classes because I was at a new school and I didn't take Latin, which meant that I had to be put in all the other remedial classes because I didn't have enough Latin for some reason. And so my English teacher said, you can choose any book you want and it'll kind of be, our thing together. And I kind of just looked at what was on her shelf, and there was a lot of Vonnegut and a lot of Asimov. And so that's what we read. And I was blown away because I had never read anything, I think like Matt, that was that structurally daring in terms of, moving through time particularly. And that's something that certainly has influenced me a lot in my own writing. I mean, the last chapter in my novel particularly like moves through Earth's history, billions of years, millions of years, from sentence to sentence, passage to passage. And that kind of confidence, that permission, I think, was given to me by Vonnegut, I think, early on, and writers like that. I think also, as he was probably one of the first writers I came across that I saw as kind of a social critic as well, that was very aware of kind of where his writing came from, and then also was also very aware of his identity, in the landscape in which he lived, as a man, as a person of a certain generation. And I'm kind of wondering how he would engage in the conversations that we're having now today in the 21st century, as an older gentleman. The last time I saw Vonnegut speak was actually in the virtual world of Second Life. He was the Vonnegut avatar, and I was there as a much more muscular version of myself with a tail. But I love that. That was kind of my last sort of Vonnegut experience because, of course, he was, often nodding at technologies, nodding at consumerism, at capitalism, how greed would ruin the planet, how war was this cyclical thing. And then here we are on this virtual platform that at the time I thought was going to be the future. I was super excited about Second Life. But that he also nodded at is like, well, you know, where could this, will a platform like this, will virtual platforms in some ways ruin the core of, you know, what we consider friendships and relationships and our ways of connecting. And, you know, in some ways, you know, they have been a detrimental thing. And then in other ways, they've given us the space to do events like this. You know, so that social critic aspect of Vonnegut, I think, has also been important to me as somebody writing in this day and age. I think climate change, I think, you know, giving voice to marginalized communities, all of that has taken sort of center stage, you know, not only for me as a writer and me thinking as a Japanese American writer as well, but also as somebody that's been seeing some really exciting things going on in the industry over the past couple of years. You know, I mean, Tor, as one example, has been doing an amazing job of publishing, you know, underrepresented voices over the past several years. John Joseph Adams, wonderful editor, has been doing a wonderful job of putting out anthologies that have been, you know, giving rise to this sort of intersectional conversation of, you know, what is a science fiction writer? You know, what are science fiction writers that we usually don't get to hear from that might be coming from communities or backgrounds that we haven't heard from? And I think Vonnegut, if we go back far enough, you know, is part of that origin. You know, would we have a Jonathan Lethem or Chabon, you know, without Vonnegut? You know, I'm not so sure. And these are writers that, you know, the literary camp, if you want to call it that, sometimes tries to claim, right? And I think Vonnegut's identity as a science fiction writer was also tenuous, you know, and that also contributed to me as I was publishing, thinking about, well, what kind of writer am I? When you first invited me to this panel, Corey, and I was like, celebrated science fiction writers. And I'm like, oh, well, first off, thank you. It's that ego stroke, but am I a science fiction writer? Like, this is a really interesting group of panelists, because I think we all, you know, other people might identify us in different ways, depending on where they've read our work. And I think, you know, now is like a wonderful time to maybe even have that conversation, because I think that is also part of Vonnegut's legacy, because he was somebody that understood that, you know, I'm friends with Theodore Sturgeon, I'm friendly with a lot of other people in genre, but at the same time, I want my work widely read. And, you know, when he was rising in the 60s and 70s, there was definitely some, you know, some snobbery going on regarding, you know, what was considered sci-fi. So, how about Lincoln? Yeah, I can.
Yeah, well, I agree with all that. In terms of my own influence, Vonnegut was a huge influence for me. He's someone I read very young, you know, maybe as befits a nerdy teenage white male dude alienated in rural Virginia. I think actually the first book I ever read with him was Cat's Cradle that my father gave me. My father was a big science fiction reader when he was younger, and although I was already a big reader, he like wanted to push the books that made him be a reader on me. And I remember he gave me Cat's Cradle, Ursula K. Le Guin's The Left Hand of Darkness, Dune, Frank Herbert's Dune, and Stranger in a Strange Land. All books, especially the first three, that I really love. But Cat's Cradle especially, I think, spoke to me. I think, you know, in addition to what everyone has said, Vonnegut, something I always loved about Vonnegut was the way that he married these big ideas and these social critiques with just like a great sense of play, right? His books are very funny, they're very fun. He pulls out these kind of postmodern tricks, like including doodles in some of the books, but in a very readable way that it doesn't feel like he's, you know, talking down to you or anything. And I think probably all the authors who influenced me, especially when I was a teenager, had that kind of combination of seriousness and playfulness. I'm thinking of like Italo Calvino and Ursula K. Le Guin and Shirley Jackson and Kobo Abe and Franz Kafka. But Vonnegut was definitely the first of those that I read like that. And so probably a very formative influence on me. I would be very happy if I had a reviewer say that my novel was Vonnegut-esque or something. I definitely attempted to kind of marry some big ideas and philosophical questions with, just a rollicking good time.
That's the best way to put it. Because you finished up this question, you get to start the next one. So question number 3 we got is, how has the field of science fiction changed since Vonnegut was writing, and how has it stayed the same?
Well, yeah, that's a good question, and I feel like it's a hard one because I imagine, I think that science fiction has gone through several eras and several tectonic shifts since Vonnegut times. I think there's things that feel different to me about maybe the current state of science fiction. I think that there's probably fewer writers that do what I was just saying, which is both try to be very funny and have a kind of lot of big ideas going on. People may disagree with me there. I think there's often writers who are one or the other, like there's just kind of going for straight comedy or they're going for the big ideas. And maybe the kind of talk about, I teach science fiction writing to students. I know other panelists do too. And the biggest thing that my students talk about these days is world building. And I think that that's kind of, one of the number one things in the kind of sci-fi fantasy conversation these days, and especially a kind of rigorous logical world building that I think is very different from the kind of more freewheeling world building that Vonnegut and many other writers of that era did. So that might be a difference. But on the flip side, and I'm kind of repeating what Sequoia said here, but I do think definitely of Vonnegut as one of these writers who existed both as a writer and kind of at a time in which the kind of boundaries between quote unquote literary fiction and science fiction were kind of blurring. He's kind of a precursor to the new wave with Delaney and Ballard and Le Guin. And I do think that in 2021, it feels like we're kind of circling back to that time. And, we have a lot of writers, including our panelists today, who really feel free to jump between different genres. And, you see people like Carmen Maria Machado and Kelly Link and Charles Yu, who publish in science fiction and fantasy magazines, but also compete for Pulitzers and National Book Awards and such. And yeah, like I said, I think this panel is really evidence of that. And I certainly hope that I'm, kicking a few bricks out of that barrier between science fiction and quote unquote literary myself. Oh, and I guess I'll call on Charlie J.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so I think it was Sarah earlier who mentioned Jonathan Lethem, or no, it was Sequoia who mentioned Jonathan Lethem and Michael Chabon. And, there was I feel like there's been the big shift in science fiction is really that in the last 20, 30 years, there really has been a breaking down of this kind of asinine divide between, literary and genre. And I think that to the extent that it exists today, I've said this a lot lately, I think to the extent that that divide still exists, it's largely a function of academia. I think academia maybe wants to keep it in place because academia is very taxonomize and prestige and let's have our fancy jackets and our less fancy jackets, and we cannot mix the fancy jacket because what will the tenure committee think, and the tenure committee, the provost, academia is very concerned with everything being in its proper place. But that's academia. I think outside of academia, that's not so much of a concern anymore. And I think that I've been a broken record about this lately, but I feel like the last several literary novels I've read, and I try to read literary fiction pretty often, were either set in the 1990s or in the future or in some kind of magical, off-kilter version of our world. I haven't read very much literary fiction set in, and this is before COVID, obviously COVID makes it harder, but I haven't read very much literary fiction lately set in the here and now. That is this is what it's like to be alive in 2018. It's no, this is what it was like to be alive in 1993, or this is what it will be like to be alive in 2040 or whatever. And I think literary fiction has kind of, much like speculative fiction, is confronted that it's really impossible to talk about the moment we've been living through. And so both genre and literary fiction have kind of reached for other times and other places, a lot of which are imaginary. And so blah, blah, blah. Point is, I think that these distinctions are increasingly irrelevant, and there's been a lot of cross-fertilization in the last 20, 30 years, and people have been kicking down those barriers. And I think that Vonnegut was kind of was one of the first to do that. And obviously Le Guin as well, from the other side, maybe. Oh, and sorry, I'm sorry. I keep forgetting to do that. I'm going to call on Sarah.
Sure. Yeah, everybody's already said really smart things. I think that there's some interesting things that Vonnegut was a precursor for, such as the fact that I don't feel as much science. There was a lot of scientific rigor. I feel like there were a couple of schools in earlier science fiction where there was the rigor, and there was we might as well write this stuff because we don't know what the actual science is in any case. And he was sort of this third thing, which was, I'm going to write I'm going to include whatever science I need to include, but I'm going to wave my hands and you're going to believe it because it's right. It's true to this story.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a through line to a lot of the genre crossing work that we see now. The way that things seem to be stratified these days, there's hard science fiction, and there's fantasy, and there's all this wiggle room in between where you get to do things like introduce your conceit and if you can make people believe it, if they win, then you win, and you get to have them for the course of that story or that book. And I think he was really good at that, and we see a lot of that today. I think the field has sort of come with him in that. I also would say that the thing that he does with the dark humor that tempers drama, to me, it's always the thing where, like, if you put a little bit of salt on French toast, it'll bring out the sweetness.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the thing that I love about, like, really good dramas that remember to have a little bit of humor, and really good comedies that make you slowly start to feel for the characters. And I think that he did that really well. And some of my favorite writers now do that really well. And you wouldn't necessarily say that they're humor writers, but there can be this that bitter whimsy, like Charlie Jane said earlier, that can infuse things, and that includes, I guess we're going to talk about people later maybe, but the new Jeff Vandermeer book, like there is, the character is kind of ridiculous and wonderful in this ridiculous way that would remind me of him. Kat Valente does that sometimes,
Mm-hmm.
where, like, the book can be bonkers, but those truths come in every once in a while and just hit you, like the lines that are direct and utterly truthful. So I'm not sure that's how much it's changed, so much as the things that he seemed to carry forward that weren't part of the time that he was writing. He always feels like someone who's a little bit out of his time to me. Which is fitting, I suppose. And Lincoln, did you go? No, you went first. Matt, are you the one who hasn't gone yet?
Sure, yeah,
All
I'm
right.
glad to go.
Good
Thanks,
game.
Sarah. Everybody said such good stuff. I think the sort of thing that sticks out really obvious to me, that what's different about science fiction and Vonnegut's time, especially early books. I mean, Solaris 5 comes out in like 1969 or something, right? Like, I mean, it's clearly a more inclusive, representative genre in both who's being published and the kind of stories that are being told. It also obviously is more mainstream. I mean, I think all of our major cultural entertainments are science fiction or fantasy, which changes the readership too, right? That we have this sort of expectation a certain way. I was thinking about sort of how I connected with Vonnegut, or why we connected with Vonnegut so much at a certain age. It feels like often like a thing, the cliche is like you read Vonnegut when you're young, right? And rereading the 3 books I read this week, I just kept thinking about like how at like 20 did I connect with this like old garrulous like World War II vet. I was like, why was this the person that I was so drawn to? It of all the books I could be like mainlining in the summer of 2000, why was this the thing? And I'm not sure exactly. I think it's interesting to think about how that works. One of the things that I've been curious about thinking about this panel is that Vonnegut, I don't think liked being called the science fiction writer. I think, like saying science fiction after Vonnegut is a little bit like science fiction after Updike or something, like, from that point of view. Like, it's like, sure, like anybody who was alive then, who isn't now, but some of that's reputation policing, right? He was just like, it's the thing we're talking about. I think don't think he was surprised that he was a science fiction writer. But it is interesting, that different claim. I mean, I think I feel in my own work, like some of the places I've been most excited about reviews for the new book are like places where it's taken really seriously in a like genre space, right? I think like I'm very excited, like a review on Tor means as much to me as a review in the New York Times. Like I'm really excited to be taken sort of seriously in those spaces in a different way than maybe someone who would try to avoid it in the past. Because those are places I hope I am and I'm working in. And I think that's probably changed too, that most of us want to be read more broadly in more spaces than in the past and are reading in more spaces. And I think that changes the work that's being done too. Sequoia.
Yeah, you're just talking about kind of, I guess, sort of, why Vonnegut, like why this person, and that, I guess, is a relationship with the sci-fi. And then I was reminded of Atwood, who's also kind of had this sort of, tenuous relationship with that label throughout her career. And not that long ago, Ishiguro kind of like entered that conversation again with the Berry Giant, and then like Wynn entered that conversation. But what came from that was this wonderful interview that Ishiguro did with Gaiman. And Gaiman said something that like, to the effect of, we need to stop, treating labels, how did he put it? Just because there's a rocket ship in something doesn't make it sci-fi, right? Just because there's a cowboy in something doesn't make it a cowboy story. And he really stressed that we need to, separate the essence of a genre, right? Sort of like the things that are part of that tradition, that are inextricable from it, from elements of that genre. You could borrow genre elements and you could simply just be, you could be a speculative writer, a sci-fi writer, you could be a literary writer, you could just be a writer. And I really love that point that, we sometimes, I think, attribute maybe too much importance to these categories. And, part of that's academia. And when Charlie Jane talked a little bit about kind of, academia and fancy jackets, and, both, Matt and I think we all teach to some degree. My fancy jackets is in the closet. And where do these critics, where do the old school critics come from? They were literature majors, a lot of them probably, and so of course they were upholding the canon for a long time. But I think that's changing. The people that that have the power now, or increasingly so, are readers, bloggers, people on YouTube, right? And the people that are giving reviews on, in mainstream magazines and newspapers, I think increasingly don't have those same prejudices anymore, thankfully. I think what else has, I guess, how else has the field changed since Vonnegut? I mentioned, I think it's the conversations of inclusivity regarding publishing is certainly, I think, something that's changing, especially in the past, 10, 5, even this last year, with regards to, underrepresented voices telling stories on their own terms. And I stress on their own terms, because when I first started writing seriously, I was thinking about, this is this kind of story that basically, I didn't say this out loud, but this is basically what I felt. This is the story that white readers want from an Asian writer, right? And I think that's starting to shift, right? And there weren't a whole lot of, when I was growing up, there wasn't a whole lot of, Asian voices, Asian faces that I could look up to, and that's starting to shift, both in film and television and then also in literature, again, on their own terms. So that's, I think, something that I've been very excited by, and I hope continues to be an ongoing trend. And I think, Vonnegut, again, he was kind of, again, this sort of grumpy, garrulous World War II vet, but at the same time, he was very aware of his identity, I think. And I'm, again, very curious about how he would enter that conversation if he were alive today. Because he does, I think, in Slaughterhouse-Five, that novel begins with basically a bullet point list of his identity, right? So he was somebody that I think was very, woke in some ways for his time.
Yeah. So now, again, we got this cool order thing where Sequoia finished that one. He gets to start the next one because that's the order we're going in. So now we're jumping away from Vonnegut a little bit. We can still incorporate Vonnegut however you choose. But the fourth question is for all the writers out there in the audience. What do you believe is the most important craft advice you can give someone working in science fiction today?
I'm going to nod back at something Lincoln said about world building, because that seems, and I teach writing as well. So whenever I get a student that's super excited about science fiction and fantasy, they're all about that world building. Almost only just that world building. That's all is world building until the cows go home. And it's exciting because they get so super passionate about the world building, and here's how this magic system works, and here's all the different kinds of witches, and here's how this planet got polluted through millions of years. Here's the different scrolls, and I try to feed that energy and enthusiasm. I think Trent Hergenrader, who's kind of does a lot of scholarship in this area, has been doing a lot of wonderful things here. I assigned them this project where they create a very intricate, fantastical or science fiction world over 2 or 3 months. And then I forced them to write a flash fiction, which is a little cruel. So here's, several thousand words. I make them create a web page of this fictional world. And then I force them to write 1,000 words based on this thing that they created. And that forces them to do a couple of things. They need to start reaching really deep into the specifics, so not about like this big expansive world that I want to, tell you about in, kind of in an information dump on page 1. I need you to talk about the butcher, the policeman, right? Some specific character who might have some arc that's related or influenced by that world. So I guess, something that I think is important for writers to remember is that you can be really excited about this premise or cool gadget or the world building, and I'm all for escapism. I want the world to pull me in. But I think it's important to step back and at least do some, at least consider how that cool thing or cool world interacts with people in some tangible way. Because without that interaction, you might just end up with, 300 pages of a really cool world. And, I think, having a little bit more of a compass with how that world interacts with characters can help you out a lot in those early stages of drafting where so much else is uncertain. How about Charlie Jane?
Okay, yeah, actually building on what Sequoia just said, which I loved. I love that idea of an exercise where you spend months on the world building and then you write a flash fiction. That's so cool. I think I'm going to try that one of these days. Yeah, I mean, I feel like one of the things that I really kind of obsess about in my own work, and I really wish that I could impress on other people in their work, is finding the personal story in whatever it is you're writing. And I think this is a thing that's kind of specific in a way to science fiction and fantasy, because you can get very easily distracted by like the shiny, baubles of like, oh, there's this interesting, cool technology. Oh, there's this like magic system. There's like all, everybody is like half elk now. We're all elk people. And like, that's cool. And like, oh yeah, we can all fly. And we've got like, jetpack boots or whatever. And, science fiction does allow you to get lost in ideas and like in kind of cool concepts. But at the same time, I feel like the best stuff is always like deeply personal in some way that reflects something that is your personal obsession, that's your kind of like, something that you're kind of grappling with in your own life or in your own psyche, or something that you're trying to get to the bottom of. that is that's your thing. And if you can find out what that is, or figure out what it is that's making you write this story, then you can kind of drill down into it and like let it inform or kind of seep into everything you're writing. And I think that that's what makes it the story. I mean, obviously making it about people is also really super important, but I think making it about like making it personal to you rather than just like a bunch of cool ideas or even a bunch of interesting characters is like often the difference between a story that's just like kind of cool or interesting and one that's like feels really kind of like deeply felt, if that makes sense. And I feel like that's what I live for, is like the deeply felt kind of personal story. And I guess I'm gonna toss it to Lincoln.
Yeah, well, yeah, I love all of this. I mean, I love that exercise. When I teach science fiction classes and talk about world building, I definitely stress that I think, world building has to be as much about constraints as it is about fleshing out an encyclopedia of a world, just because, you have a story to tell. In terms of Vonnegut, he actually has a very good little short guide to writing that probably everyone has read, but I'll just paste it into the chat, where he has some good kind of practical tips. A lot of just kind of, one I remember is he talks about just leaning into your kind of unique natural voice. He says, I should have read this before I pasted it in. If I can remember it right, something about how he comes from Indiana, which has an accent like, a buzzsaw ripping through wood or something. But, it's unique and it's his. Otherwise, I guess, really per our conversation about the arbitrariness of a lot of these borders, I think a lot of my advice for a science fiction writer would be my advice to anyone, which is to really read widely across genres, keep things weird, and just, write. And I'll pass it to Matt.
Thanks, Lincoln. Yeah, again, everything everyone's saying is right and true. So people should do all those things. I think I've been thinking a little bit about what sort of writing, especially sort of science fiction fantasy is doing for me and does for me. And we were talking a little bit about world building. One of the things that just the task of world building does for me, and my new novel has 3 sort of worlds that had to be built out, because like a past, a near future, and a far future. So I had to figure out these 3 different spaces. And I think one of the things it does is just the amount of time it takes, the sheer sort of like progression of it over a long period of time. Donna Haraway is an environmental writer, has a book called Stay with the Trouble. And I think about that phrase a lot, and that one of the things that writing a novel and building out worlds and sort of building out these spaces does is allow me to sort of stay with the trouble of the ideas of the book or the emotions of the book or the things I'm sort of researching and thinking about. And just in the 3 or 4 or 5 years of solving the problems in a world that I'm inventing, or figuring out how it works, or fixing the sentences, is like also a way to keep thinking and feeling about the things that I care about and that I want to have in this book. And you could write a simpler book than some of the books that everybody in this panel is writing, but you wouldn't maybe get some of that like engagement with what you were writing about by cutting those corners or doing something less complicated. I think the complexity itself is one of the things that gets the kind of work I want to do done, and probably does for a lot of the books I'm reading in this space as well. Sarah?
Matt, what you're saying kind of reminds me of the Theodore Sturgeon ask the next question thing, where you have what he always encouraged his students was to just push a little deeper and a little deeper into that, like lean into that question that you're wrestling with until you're sure that you've unpacked it as far as you can unpack it. Because there's always that thing that you realize if you leave it to rest a little bit, that thing that you start to realize later. But what I was actually going to say was another really simple piece of advice, which is just read it out loud. Yeah. That's the advice that I give to everyone. Read it out loud. You have to. There are things you'll never catch without it. The rhythms of language and the rhythms of sentences and of dialogue. All of it flows better when you've had a chance to read it out loud. And sometimes I'll catch those mistakes in world building or in question asking while I do that too, because it turns off my writer brain and turns on my reader brain in a way that just reading through a Word document for the 100th time won't do. So whether it's a short story or a novel, I try to read everything through out loud at least once, beginnings and endings, sometimes dozens of times.
Yeah, absolutely.
That is some excellent advice all around. Get really excited about that stuff. So we're just gonna jump out of order real quickly, just because Charlie Jane needs to head out and do her next thing, because it's book release day. So everyone, you're all muted. So just a silent round of applause for book release day for Charlie Jane. But Charlie Jane, before you head out, do you want to tell us maybe a couple of, and then after Charlie Jane answers, everyone else gets to do it too, but a couple of either up and coming science fiction writers that you're really excited about, or some recent releases that you're really excited about, whatever you want. Recommendations.
Yeah. Oof. Okay. Well, I'm really excited about a book that comes out in September called Light from Uncommon Stars by Rika Aoki, which is so fun and so just like delightful, and just like it made me so happy, and like I felt like it was just such a fantastic, blend of genres, and like one of the better portrayals of like a young trans girl that I've seen in fiction recently. What else, man? I mean, there's so much great stuff coming out right now. It's just like I feel like we're really blessed. There's just so much amazing stuff that's coming out lately, and I know if I think for like 30 seconds, I'll come up with like 10 more, and maybe I'll just type some more in the chat before I have to go in like 4 minutes. But that's all I got for now, because like there's 100, but I'm trying to think what I've read recently, anyway, or what's coming new, what's new. So I guess I'll toss it to Sequoia. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, you stole my first one, which was also Light from Uncommon Stars, which is wonderful. But also, let's say recently, I guess anytime I have an excuse to read Ken Liu, I'll take it. So The Hidden Girl is another story collection from Ken. I haven't read this yet, but I loved her Numenon series. Activation Degradation is a soft robot novel coming out from Marina Lostetter. And if you haven't read the Numenon trilogy, if you're into space opera, but space opera with like heart, it's a really unique novel that kind of goes into the everyday lives of a generation colony ship. There's one that came out a couple of years ago, but I think it didn't get read as widely as his first collection, is Universal Love by Alexander Weinstein. And if you didn't read his first collection, that's Children of the New World. There's also a film adaptation that was made that is, I guess, coming relatively soon. That was adapted from a story from that first collection called Saying Goodbye to Yang, which is another robot story. What else? Future Feeling, maybe by Joss Lake is I think another one that I was excited by. I just started reading it, and I haven't read this one yet, but I'm excited by the author. Clean Air by Sarah Blake, who also wrote them on. So. Oh, Lincoln, yes.
Yeah, well, I guess if we're sticking, it was part of the question, like whether there are books that maybe like have a kind of Vonnegut edge to them or something. And sorry, what?
If you want there to be.
Well, one book like that I thought was very fun is, and I hope I'm pronouncing the last name right here, but Calvin Kalsuke's Several People Are Typing, which I think maybe comes out in like a week or a month. It's pretty soon, but it takes place, the form of the book is entirely in a Slack app, if anyone has ever used Slack before. And it starts with a character whose his consciousness gets accidentally uploaded into Slack, and then they have to deal with their employees. Feels very Vonnegut-esque. It's really good fun. Some other kind of sci-fi fantasy books that I read this year that I really loved, and these are not really up-and-comers, by which I mean they're very established, but is Susanna Clarke's Piranesi, I was really, really taken by, and Kevin Brockmeyer's The Ghost Variations has maybe a bit of a Vonnegut kind of tie-in of a lot of formal play and stuff. It's a very kind of like Calvino-esque collection of 100 different ghost stories. And a book that's coming out that I'm excited by is Gretchen Felker Martin's Manhunt, which I wouldn't say is very Vonnegut-esque, but it's a very bloody, wild horror book that has a kind of interesting spin on a zombie apocalypse type scenario. And yeah, those are a few, and maybe I'll pass it to Sarah.
Yeah, so on the Vonnegut-esque front, there were a couple of short stories that came to mind. One was Chen Shifan's Year of the Rat, which was a really cool story translated from Chinese by Ken Liu. I think you can find it in the Hidden Planets anthology, or Invisible Planets. And Meg Ellison's story, The Pill, which just won the Locus Award. It's a novelette. And just in terms of getting that biting political edge with a little bit of dark humor in it, I thought both of those nailed that. Upcoming or new stuff, Psalm for the Wild Built by Becky Chambers is a great new novella about a monk and a robot, a tea monk, long after robots have been released into the wild to form their own society. And it was the first thing that I could read after the start of the pandemic. I went through this kind of buzzy period where I couldn't read anything, and that was just this beautiful, kind book that brought me back. And then I was just thinking a lot about just the people on the cutting edge of short fiction right now, and all of the recent. The other thing I've read a lot of this year is collections, and in particular the small beer collections that have come out have just knocked it out of the park. Elwyn Cotman's Dance on Saturday, Isabel Yap's new collection, Elia Dawn Johnson's new collection, Jeff Ford's new collection. And again, not all those people are new names, but they might be new to you, and those are all fantastic.
I think that leaves me, so we can speed up the passing. We'll just take this time for forthcoming stuff to shill for Lincoln and Sequoia, right? Read both of those. I've read Sequoia's already. It's fantastic. I'm excited to read Lincoln's. I brought a couple of books. Nice thing about being at home, right, is I just have my books, so I can just show you the things that I'm excited about. This came out last year. Shauna Porter's The Seep is one of my just favorite sort of sci-fi books I've read the last couple of years. So really, like, kind of, yeah, Sequoia. It's like a utopian, soft alien invasion book. It's really, really smart and really interesting. And I've read it twice since it came out and just can't recommend it enough. Things I'm excited about coming out. Cassandra Cause, The All-Consuming World. I really like Cassandra's writing. I heard them talk about this at a event we both did this summer. It just sounded really great. So I'm really excited to dig into that. Cassandra has another book coming out called Nothing But Blackened Teeth. It's a little more horror this year that also looks really great. We're checking out. And then something I'm looking forward to, and I was also excited to see this person in the audience, so I'll talk about while they're here, is Claire Holroyd's The Effort, which I'm really excited to read. It's right at the top of my pile. So it's nice to see Claire today, and I already have her book on the desk to show her. So yeah, wave at it, Claire. That's nice. But I'm really excited for all of those. So thank you.
Ooh, those are all great recommendations, and all of them can be somehow obtained through your local library if you want to come hang out at any point in time and get those books. I'm going to throw one recommendation out there also, just because I think that she in some ways does some kind of like Vonnegut humor. But Tamsin Muir's Gideon the Ninth and like Harrow the Ninth were both amazing and hilarious and like kind of sci-fi and kind of horror, but also very much fantasy. And there are some hilarious jokes and they're like laugh out loud, funny, amazing. For the sake of time, we should probably jump into Q&A. We should probably do like 15 minutes of Q&A, so that way we get some audience interaction, and then everyone also gets to go off and live their life, so they're not staring at screens for all of eternity. The way that our Q&A usually works is you got the chat. Send over a question. We'll run through Q&A for about 15 minutes, and then that'll be about it. So so shoot over those chat questions. They can be general, they can be specific. If anyone in the audience has them, you just look at me and just say, here's the question. I'm also gonna take this time to put in another link for all of the independent bookstores where you can purchase the writer's work. It's super important to be supportive of these independent bookstores and to be supportive of like almost any bookstore, because I always give this pitch during these talks. Basically, if you love science fiction, if you love horror, if you love fantasy, if you love mystery, if you love romance, if you love any of these genres, the way they really flourish is by supporting them, right? It's like the idea of voting with your dollar, right? But it's voting for the genre with your dollar. The more you support that thing, the more it's going to be in the world. And the more it's in the world, the more happy I will be. And that's all I really care about. It's like you guys making me happy. So thank you. It's always awkward over Zoom because you don't know if your jokes land and you're like, oh my God, was that terrible or no?
We'll send you a ranking later, Corey.
Oh, please don't do that.
Yeah.
What do we got? Looking for some stuff.
Yeah.
People are slow at typing tonight. Question from Claire. Claire asks, do you get pressure to ever, I've got the screen slightly off. Do you get pressure to lean more commercial? How do you stay true to your vision while also considering readability? That is an awesome question, Claire. Thank you.
I can just say briefly that I don't think I get pressured to do much of anything, which I appreciate. I think I mean, part of it is I just sort of disappear and write books and then come back with them. So like I usually tell my agent what I've been doing when I've been doing it for a long time. I just sent him what I've been working on for like the last 2 years, not the book, just like a note. This is what it is. I just got a note back from this, like, well, we'll make it work as always. You know, just like, okay, you know, that's sort of what I want. I actually feel lucky that I think I always send him something. I'm like, this is super weird. No one's going to like this. I'm going to go die in a hole. And he's like, actually, that's pretty commercial. We're going to go find your people. And I'm like, great. You know, so that seems like the sort of ideal relationship for me, is that I do whatever I want. Other people believe it's commercial, but maybe that's just a lucky thing. I mean, I don't know if that really works out, but in like, it's a nice like vibe, right? You know, yeah.
I don't think I've ever felt pressured to lean more commercial. I don't think I've ever had an idea that I would call commercial by like per se. I think if you're lucky, the ideas that you or if you train yourself, the ideas that you have will be commercial, and you can, you know, fit into those boxes if that's what you want to do. And I think it's a conscious decision if it, you know, which direction that you want your career to head, which projects you choose to spend your time on.
Yeah, I don't think I've gotten pressure. I think if there's any pressure, it came from my own imagination, you know, of what I felt I needed to do. But I think even then I was like, I want to write what I want to write ultimately, you know. I will say that, you know, when I was after my first collection, you know, and I was shopping around for agents again, you know, I was like, well, you know, maybe I'll write a little more traditionally for a little bit, you know, and just kind of, you know, because I was trying to be, you know, realistic about, you know, what might get a larger readership. But, you know, I think Matt's right. You know, like if you find the right champions for the work, you know, you can still make it work, because there's a lot of weird writing, experimental writing out there that does get fairly large readerships because they had the right agents, and because, you know, that one editor was willing to take a chance on it. I'm not saying that it's not a tough road, a tougher road than if you're writing something that's, you know, more of a traditional beach type read. But, you know, I think you know, personally, I would rather stick to my guns and you know, write weird experimental stuff. So I guess that's my answer.
Yeah, my first novel hasn't come out yet, so you maybe check back with me in a month or something to see if my editor has been sending me angry texts. But you know, I think, but what Sequoia said is how I feel, which is that, you know, on the one hand, I write weird, you know, jokey body horror, whatever, sci-fi, and like that's just what I'm gonna probably keep writing. And at the same time, you know, yeah, you don't really know what will be commercial. Like,
Right.
Someone brought up Jeff Vandermeer before, and Annihilation is a very strange and very beautiful book that became a huge commercial success. And you can't really go around chasing the commercial trends too much. The way publishing works is very slow. By the time your book comes out, that trend has moved on to something else. So if you really try to chase the commercial, it typically doesn't work.
Could you imagine if you set out to chase the commercial in like 2018 and then like June 2020 your book comes out, right? Like you've missed the trend of like Earth, not just publishing, right? I mean, like there's just no way to try to be there.
Well, maybe what you just said, I guess Corey is moderating, but some people are talking about Doug's question, which does fit into what Matt just said.
Yeah.
Might be a good one.
Can we answer Doug's question, Corey?
I think we have to, because otherwise, no, I don't approve of that. We're not doing it. I am in control. No one will wrestle it from my hands. So Doug asks, how do you all feel about whether or how the current fairly grim during apocalyptic mood will shape the genre in the next several years? That is a great question, Doug. Thank you.
So my 2019 novel was about a pandemic, and turned out to be like accidentally prescient. And I have to say that what the current fairly grim mood around us makes me want to do is write anything but near future. So I had both of my near future books were in the can already when all of this started, and I don't know that I could do that right this second. And I think that maybe we'll see less near future science fiction because it's hard to see near future, and I think we'll see more far future. I think we'll see more historical, for whatever values you set for historical, and maybe more of what K.M. Sparrow calls like alternate near future, where you sort of don't assume that it's this world because you have to ignore a whole lot of things that have happened.
Yeah, I'm going to jump in here because my 2022 novel has a plague in it. And as I mentioned, I've been working on this in some way, shape, or form for almost a decade. And my agent was submitting it to publishers in the early days of COVID. And it's something that I was very afraid of how editors would respond, how when we were talking to Hollywood, how producers would respond, how readers would respond. But I had a really honest talk with my agent, and ultimately we decided it's not, some readers might avoid it, but ultimately it's not a plague novel. It's not a plague with capital P. It's not Outbreak. It's not The Hot Zone.
Right.
It's ultimately about human relationships and people, and how we reimagine grief and hold on to hope, and imagine a better world and a better version of ourselves. And a lot of those things transcend any historical moment. So I imagine I'll be giving that talk with every reading in the coming year, because it is a tough thing, this time that we're living in. But at the same time, I had to edit this novel, during the pandemic. The novel was born from, me losing my grandfather several years ago, and I lost my father this past year, and so sitting with this novel that is, dark in a lot of ways, but also very hopeful, I think it was a very cathartic experience. So, and it was interesting that I saw a lot of people rushing out to buy or reread Station 11, in the early days of COVID. So I want to say that we will move away from the current moment or from these types of narratives, but I'm also not so sure as well. I'm also trying to think about, when was the first time I saw a 9/11 novel, after 9/11 happened. It seemed like it was a few years. I think it was a Deborah Eisenberg short story that I read. And that was like 4 or 5 years after the fact, but I feel like it might be longer this time around. But I'm not sure, who's to say. I feel like a lot of fabulism, I could sort of see this being kind of like a nice time for kind of the fabulist story. of kind of, again, alternate types of worlds, alternate histories, reimagining reality. I guess those are the types of stories that excite me, so I'm a little selfish.
I think I agree with Sarah was saying about maybe like the near future maybe going away, but I think some of that also is practical if you've been doing a lot of it. I mean, I feel like I got done writing a near future climate future, and the last thing on earth I want to do is make another one, right? And like I said, what I had to say about the climate in 2079, like over the last 5 years. I talked to another writer, had a couple years ago, at a climate change book that came out and did really well. And I found that we were both sort of writing, he was writing a like historical fantasy and I'm writing something set on like another planet. And we both were just like, I just can't do it again right away in the like near future, like Earth realm. It was just like, it just felt, also you said what you wanted to say, but it just felt impossible to go right back to the like crushingness of the near future in a certain way. And it feels like that's probably going to be even more true in the pandemic space, whether we do different kinds of things, or just move to alternate spaces for a little while.
Just to be the odd one out, I'll say that for my own end, I actually feel like more drawn to near future stuff these days, and most of the kind of short stories I've been working on are in that vein. And yeah, I don't know. Yeah, it's hard to say. I think that a lot of what was said seems right. Like, I think, there probably will be a lot of books that deal with aspects of our current moment, but probably at some kind of slant, whether that's a kind of more magical realist or fabulous take, or it's a far, far future take or something. But, at the same time, I don't know, you never know. Like, a lot of the really dark dystopian science fiction, came about in an era when like nuclear war was a huge threat and was in the news every day. And the early days of when everyone talked about acid rain and the ozone layer, which kind of like dipped away for a while and now has come back. And yeah, I mean, I guess this is just another reason it's impossible to predict what will become popular.
We may all have just described the like, this is what I'm doing about that problem, as opposed
Yeah,
to what
true.
people will do about that problem.
Well, yeah, there's a selfishness too, and that my book, like Sequoia's, is not a plague novel, but does take place in a world in which like plagues and climate change have really threatened everyone, and life has kind of changed accordingly. And yeah, in some ways it's maybe hopefully like feels a little prescient. Part of it takes place in a future baseball league that's run by biotech and pharmaceutical companies, and people are kind of cheering for Moderna and Pfizer in the way that they are now on Twitter. So that was one thing that I sold the novel before COVID hit, but that feels like a little weird. So hopefully people won't be too bored of that in a month.
I mean, there something like some of the conditions of life have not changed that dramatically from the past to the future? Like some of the issues are the same. Like, just to bring it back around to Vonnegut, like I was rereading Galapagos today, and there's a part in that, we wrote in 1985 or something. There's a part where he talks about if aliens came to Earth and they saw how humans were treating the environment, they would think the environment had just like the natural world had rose up and threatened humans, and humans had to kill it as fast as they could. And like that's 35, 36 years ago, like that's not really that different than what we're talking about now. We just changed the terms or the science on it, that sentiment's old, right? Yeah.
I think on that note, we're probably going to wrap up for tonight.
Oh, that's such a bummer note, Corey.
Do we want to?
No. You just have to be positive on the way out.
We can stay for another like hour or so if you guys want. I know all here for. Yeah, but on that really dark note, I'm going to put another link in the chat. And if you feel like ordering some books, which you all should, because who doesn't want more books? And if the post-apocalypse or the apocalypse happens, you want as many books as you can have, because like fire, really good. You can boil your water on it, which is important. Cook your food. Maybe you could insulate like a jacket with it if you crumple it. You got to get creative. But again, please support the writers, because it's really important. It's what we need to happen to keep having sci-fi be a thing, which is great. And finally, we got to say a big thank you to everyone for coming out tonight, right? Thank you, audience. And then ultimately, thank you, panelists, for doing this. It was so good. This was amazing. I was so excited for this. And,
thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, I'm going to turn off the recording.